When we consider the economy as a whole, the macroeconomy as we call it, we're trying to determine the level of income which will bring about, let's say, full employment or no inflation or a balance of payments equilibrium. So we're trying to achieve objectives, and what we do is we see the economy as being composed of flows of income, and these flows of income flow around the system. And what we want to do is to see what determines the flows, the amount of income flowing in the system, and also how it comes into balance. Is it stable or is it unstable? Does it vary widely or is it constant? And if we can determine the flows of income and all of the determinants of the flows of income, then we would have some way of perhaps intervening in the economy and regulating the economy to bring about, say, full employment. Now, right at the very start, I have to say that this is a Keynesian policy. This is based on the work of John Maynard Keynes back in the 1930s, and on the subsequent people who believed in Keynes and who are still around, Keynesians. But also there are many people, many economists who think this is wrong and that intervention in the economy is wrong, it's dangerous, and it's not productive in the long run. So it is controversial, it's political, but it's important that we understand the concept of the circular flow without getting involved at this time in the politics or the various debates about it. So we're going to look at the circular flow of income and what determines the circular flow of income, and see how this gives us an insight into the workings of the whole economy. So we're going to start by talking about injections and leakages. Well, if you can imagine a flow of anything, a flow of water going around a system, if you inject more water, there'll be more flowing around the system. If you take some out, a leakage, or if there's a leakage in the system, there'll be less flowing around. So if we have the economy, try to imagine the flow is not water, it's now income flowing around the system. If some leaks out, if we spend the income on something else so that it leaks out, there'll be less left flowing around the system. And that may mean there are fewer people at work. That may mean that there'll be greater poverty and deprivation. On the other hand, if we inject income into the circular flow, there will be more income flowing around the system. Let's see how it works, and it'll perhaps make it a bit clearer. We'll start with what's known as a two-sector model. A two-sector model is, in our case here, just households and firms. And this is the flow of real goods and services. We're not concerned with money at the moment. Real goods and services. We're interested in the things that we buy, the real goods, the food, the household products, the car, the real things. And we're interested in how they come about. So in our two-sector model, two sectors, households and firms, just the two, we have a flow of goods and services from the firms to the households. So the companies, the firms, make things and give them to us. That's the picture we've got at the moment. We get the goods and services from the firms. Of course, we give our labour to the firms in return. So the real sector here, the real flow of goods, is we get real things, and in return we put in our effort, our energy into the companies to make the things. So there's households and firms, real goods flowing from the firms to the households, real effort, real labour effort flowing from the households to the firms. We go to work and we make the things. Now there is a monetary side to this, that's in real terms, but obviously we have to buy the goods and services, and in return for labour we get paid. We live in a monetary economy. We don't live in a barter economy where we're bartering our services directly for goods and services. We use money. So the monetary equivalent here is the firms give us income. We call income Y in economics. That's because John Maynard Keynes, 1936, called it Y. and it's stuck. So whenever we see Y in economics, it means income. And we give the firms consumption expenditure, C. Now, I should point out here, there is a difference between consumption and consumption expenditure. Consumption expenditure happens at a moment in time, and consumption happens over time. When you buy a pair of shoes, you wear the shoes many, many times. You consume the shoes over time, but you bought the shoes at a moment in time. So we're really dealing here with consumption expenditure. Now let's go back to the circular flow. Well, we have households and firms. We have income flowing from the firms to the households, consumption expenditure flowing from the households to the firms. Now that's what we call a closed loop. Closed because whatever the value of income is, so also will be the value of consumption expenditure. It can't go anywhere else. It's closed. It must flow around in the way that the diagram indicates. So if we just use symbols for a moment, we have Y for income, C for consumption expenditure, and that's the monetary flow in symbols. It's a closed loop, so if, for example, Y is 100, then C would be 100. It can't be anything else. It's closed. It can't go anywhere else. If Y is 500, you guessed it, C is 500. It can't go anywhere else. So we can draw a diagram of this. If we put C, consumption expenditure on the vertical axis and Y on the horizontal axis, we can draw a picture. For example, the one I did earlier, 100 and 100, 100, we can plot it out there. We can graph it. 500 and 500, we can graph it. If you join all of those up, you will get a 45-degree line. And that's very important to us, because later we'll be dealing with something called a 45-degree diagram. So we got a diagram out of this. Let's go back to the circular flow. We'll come back to that diagram again in a moment, but let's go to the circular flow. There are leakages out of the system. Savings is a leakage. For example, we don't spend all the income we receive. Sometimes we save some. Well, if you just save it, it can create a problem. Let's take a time period. Let's say we have an income of 100 and we have this time period. So we're going to save something, and let's assume we save 10% of our income. No matter what happens, we are determined to save 10% of our income. Just pretend. Now that would mean that we would spend 90 and save 10. So our income is 100, we save 10, spend 90. C is equal to 90. We're saving 10%. But if you think about this now, the firm can't pay out 100. It doesn't receive 100, it only receives 90. So income has fallen. That means workers will receive less. They can't receive 100. They used to receive 100, now they only receive 90. So the amount of income flowing in the system has been reduced. If we continue to save 10%, then we would save another 9 and spend 81, which would mean the firms are now paying out 81. So you can see the level of income is falling. And as the level of income falls, there'll be more unemployment, more poverty, less jobs. It's not what we want. Finally, we would end up with a table like this one on the bottom right of the screen. After a period of time periods, savings and income is falling from 100 all the way down to, in this case, 65.6. What we really need is some way of putting the savings back in. We need to put the savings back into the economy, and where we do that is through banks. The banks are in business to take our savings and then lend the savings out to somebody else at a higher rate of interest. The banks live on the difference between the two rates of interest. If the banks are paying you 5% for your savings, they will lend it out at 7% to someone else perhaps. The 2% is their profit. That's how they exist. That's how they pay for the buildings and the staff and make a profit. So savings come out of the households and go into the firms, into the banks, I should say. Now, that's quite rational. It's not very rational just to take the savings and shove them under the bed. But putting the savings into the banks where you get a return on the money, that's rational. That makes sense. First of all, the banks, well, there are two problems. It must keep enough deposits to deal with day-to-day withdrawals. We have the illusion in the banks, with the banks, that if we go looking for our money, it's there. In fact, the money has been lent out to someone else. But yet, when you want your savings back, you can go to the bank and withdraw it. That's because the banks keep a proportion of the money as a contingency, just in case we arrive in. And not everybody goes into the bank at the same time, on the same day, looking for their savings out. So if some people go in, they will have the money to pay out. If everybody went in looking for their savings on the same day, the bank would not have it. It's lent it out to someone else. But of course, going back to the circular flow for a second, this is the diagram we had earlier. Why should it be that the banks can lend out exactly what we're saving? And that's the second problem here. Why should investors wish to borrow exactly the amounts that savers want to save? That's a big issue. Needless to say, this is market economics, so the market solves the problem. If we consider the price of money is just the rate of interest. Everything's got a price, money's got a price. The rate of interest is the price of money. And if I just put the cursor onto the slide, there we are. Here is the savings. Savings will increase as the rate of interest increases. If you're getting 5% at the bank for your savings at the moment, and the bank increases it to 10%, you might think you want to save some more because you get some more interest. On the other hand, the borrowers, well, as the rate of interest rises, less people want to borrow. It's too expensive. As the rate of interest falls, more people want to borrow. So what we've got is a supply and demand diagram. The price of money is here, the rate of interest, and this is the quantity of money, the savings and investment, and the savings, and that's investment. If the rate of interest is, let's say, at R1, whatever that is, it's above the equilibrium, so now we're saving more than we're investing. That means the banks have got too much savings. So the banks will try to get rid of the savings. It's living on the difference in the interest. It wants to lend it out. So the banks will then cut the rate of interest, and it'll keep cutting it until it gets to an equilibrium. So the banks are balancing savings and investment. If it was the other way around, if we had a very low rate of interest, then borrowers would want to borrow more than we're saving, so the rate of interest would rise. And eventually we get to the stage where investment equals savings. And that's exactly what we wanted in our circular flow diagram. That's what we want. We want savings to equal investments. And if that happens, the equilibrium, the balance in the circular flow has been maintained. The value of y does not vary from time period. It stays the same. The amount of income flowing around the system remains the same. It remains the same because the banks, through the rate of interest, have balanced savings and investment. So we end up with this diagram where it's balanced. There are other leakages, however. M for imports. We buy goods from abroad. Some people send money abroad to family and friends. People go on holidays abroad, which is taking income out of the country. People buy foreign cars, buy foreign televisions, whatever. So we need to pay for the imports, and what we need is exports to balance imports. Now, fortunately for us again, there is a mechanism for this. The price that we pay for imports, which is paid in foreign currency, that price is determined by the exchange rate. So it's the exchange rate that balances imports and exports. Now, there will be separate class on foreign exchange and exchange rates and international trade in general. But for the moment, M equals X because the exchange rate adjusts. Sometimes the pound or the dollar or whatever it is high, sometimes it's low, sometimes it moves radically, it moves very fast, sometimes it's relatively constant for a period of time, whatever. The point is that the exchange rate is moving so as to make imports more expensive or cheaper, to make exports more expensive or cheaper. And the exchange rate finds the balance between the two. So it's the exchange rate that is very important to us in this context. Another leakage out of the system is taxation. Well, we talk about taxation in the context of what we call fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is about the government borrowing and taxation. Government borrowing, taxation, and then government expenditure on the other side. So here we got T equals taxation, G equals government expenditure. And if the government balances its account, if it spends exactly what it takes in, then the circular flow would be maintained. The circular flow would be constant. So let's just have a quick overview of that. Here we've got leakages. The leakages are savings, S, M, imports, T, taxation. And those balance with the injections, which are I, investment, expenditure, X, export earnings, and G, government expenditure. And the way the S balances with I is through the rate of interest in the banks. The way that M, imports, balances with X, exports, is through the exchange rate. Changes in the exchange rate make imports and exports cheap or expensive, as is the case may be. And T for taxation balances with G for government expenditure if the government balances its accounts. Now, let's look at the leakages. There we've got them. If we didn't have a mechanism to put those back, the level of income would fall and we would become very poor. There would be a lot of unemployment, companies would close because there's not enough income flowing around the system. It's just leaking out into nothing. We need those injections to balance the two to ensure that we've got the level of income relatively constant. Now, the value of the level of income, well, just looking at our diagram here, just put cursor back on. Here's Y. Well, that's equal to C, consumption expenditure, plus I, investment expenditure, plus G, plus X, beg your pardon, plus X, export earnings, plus G, government expenditure. So Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X. And of course the total value of expenditure, what we spend, household spending, is E. So E is the total of our expenditure, which is equal to what we spend, consumer expenditure, what companies spend, investment expenditure, what the government spends, government expenditure, and X, what foreigners spend on our goods and services. Now, we can represent these over time. We can see how investment expenditure changes over time and how government expenditure changes over time, which is plotted as a simple graph. We'll just contrive one, and that could be it. It may not be. It doesn't matter. It's just a bunch of lines. You see them on the financial press all the time. They're very, very up and down sort of graphs. It doesn't matter really. The point is that we know that E is equal to C plus I plus G plus X. And if you add these vertically, take any point on here. So we have E1 is equal to C1 plus X1 plus G1 plus I1. So you add up all of those together, you get up to this point here. The diagram is not very pretty. So in order to make it clearer so we can understand it, let's just get rid of all of the ups and downs and make it look a bit prettier. So the same diagram, the same logic, the same reasoning, and we just straightened out all the lines just to make it look more understandable. I've also got rid of some of these lines. If you go back here, I've got X, G and I. I've added those three together and call it J. J for injections. So just one line as opposed to having three, or yeah, these three lines here all over the place. So just have one. So now we've got E is equal to C plus I plus G plus X. There's E plus C plus I, G plus X. E is equal to C plus J. Same thing. Now, by the way, we call I autonomous because it doesn't vary over time, or it doesn't vary with anything. It doesn't vary with income. We just make it autonomous, which is just a way of making it horizontal. Makes it easy to understand. Just forget about the complication of how they vary over time. Just make it easy. So we'll keep it down there. Okay, so if we can go back to a diagram we had way back, this one here, where we had the 45-degree diagram, and I showed you how to develop the 45-degree diagram. We can do that here. We've got E. I've just changed time over here to Y, to income. Well, our consumption will rise as our income rises. Yeah, okay. And we've made these autonomous. We'll just assume they're constant. Just make it simple. Keep it easy. We have our 45-degree line, and we have E is equal to C plus J plus I, G and X here. So it's a very simple, just very clean sort of diagram, the one we just made up. If we take the point Y1, so at Y1, then E is greater than Y1. We see, for E to be the same as Y1, it would have to cut at the 45-degree line. But over here, it's greater. So E is greater than Y1. Expenditure is greater than income. Therefore, income will rise. It's the case that income must rise because the expenditure is going somewhere. In this case, income will rise to Y2. But at Y2 here, expenditure is greater. There's a little gap in here. Expenditure is greater, so it would have to increase even further. So the differences are getting very small, so eventually we will get to a balance. We get to the point where E cuts the 45-degree line, and the amount of expenditure in the economy is exactly the same as the amount of income. At that point, the circular flow of income is complete. It's in balance. Okay, so that's an overview of the circular flow of income. That's how the 45-degree diagram comes about, and that's how we've reasoned that there is a balance in the national income. So E is equal to Y, and we've shown how that comes about. This diagram, the one we've got on the screen at the moment, is extremely important in economics because we can use it to explain inflation, unemployment, and we can use it for all sorts of reasons. But this is a very, very important diagram. This is one that must be understood if you're going to have a clear picture of macroeconomics and a clear understanding of macroeconomics. But some of those topics are for other classes. In the meantime, thank you for watching.